what Israel wants. It's made no secret that it wants to depopulate Gaza by whatever means it can, by starving people into leaving, by expelling them, or by killing them all. And there's no question that it meets the definition of genocide. They have the intent to destroy an entire people. They have the ability, and they are in fact carrying out an operation intended to do so. So that is very clear. I think it's also quite clear why Hamas did what it did. That is, this was in the nature of a jailbreak from the world's largest concentration camp. The men who came out of Gaza in some 15 different locations had a firm grasp of what their mission was. It was a military raid into military installations, including kibbutzim settlements with a military function, and usually staffed by regular soldiers from the Israeli Defense Force. Those soldiers had in fact been removed by Mr. Netanyahu to protect settlers as they expanded their eviction of Palestinians on the West Bank. So the kibbutzim were not well defended, but they were defended. When the Hamas people came out of Gaza, other groups followed them, and a lot of civilians. And having been treated like animals, they behaved like animals. And what they did in terms of the horrors they visited on the inhabitants of the kibbutzim was truly horrible, inexcusable. It reminds Americans of our own history of slave revolts, in which slaves, for example, the most famous one being Nat Turner, slaves revolted and killed all the whites that they could find. And there was, of course, no excuse for those murders, and they were morally and legally inexcusable, but they were understandable given the manner in which those who were leading the revolt had been treated. And I think the same thing is true with the Palestinians in Gaza. What they did was horrifying. It was inexcusable, but it was understandable. The Israeli reaction has been vastly disproportionate. That is Israel's custom. It tries to react disproportionately in order to intimidate and to deter anyone from attacking it. And so that is not new. But what is new is the genocidal statements and the proposed emptying of Gaza that I have referred to. Some of the former settlers, Israeli settlers in Gaza, have vowed to come back. They will find themselves in a wasteland. 60% of the buildings in northern Gaza have been destroyed. And we know that something over 12,000 Palestinians have been murdered by one means or another. Israel has destroyed most of the hospitals in Gaza. It now seems to be working on the schools. So it is totally ruthless. And the whole thing is particularly macabre because it is such a vivid reminder of the Warsaw Ghetto, a very parallel situation in which, driven beyond any ability to tolerate what was being done to them, the Jewish inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto rose against Nazi Germany, and the Nazis exterminated them all and leveled the ghetto. One would think that the survivors of that Holocaust and the larger Holocaust in Europe would not wish to repeat a Holocaust against another people. But evidently that is expecting too much of human nature. So we have a case of a breakout from a concentration camp, dreadful things being done to anyone who was in the way of that. And by the way, it now appears that much of the killing at the rave, meaning the music festival that was going on ironically, right next to Gaza, where music festivals are not a common occurrence, that much of the killing there was actually done by Israeli forces, who fired indiscriminately at both the Hamas warriors and the milling crowds at the festival. Similarly, some of the major damage in the kibbutzim and the murders of the settlers there were done not by Hamas, but by Israeli forces firing tank bullets into houses and the like, and hellfire missiles into cars and so forth. So this was a dreadful beginning to what has turned out to be an absolutely nauseating month and a half of slaughter, not finished. Meanwhile, the world stands by. The United States has the ability to stop this by halting arms supplies to Israel, but does not do that, opposes a ceasefire in support of Mr. Netanyahu's revenge against the Palestinians. And Mr. Netanyahu, I would remind you, is on record many years ago as expressing hope for a war in which Israel could expel all the Arabs in its midst, and seems to be taking advantage of this to do that, hoping, I suppose, that his reputation, which has been greatly damaged by charges of corruption and by his suspension of judicial independence in Israel, can somehow be redeemed by this act of revenge. So where we are is a very bad place. I note also there are parallels in terms of the unwillingness of the West to act forcefully against South African apartheid, and having been intimately involved in the negotiations with South Africa, Cuba, and Angola that began to catalyze the end of apartheid, I can tell you that the decisive move there was the suspension of refinancing of South African debt by Swiss banks. So Israel has been forced to borrow $6 billion internationally, apparently at quite high interest rates, because of a perceived political risk. If someone doesn't stop the weapons supply to Israel one way or another, it may be that the bankers will pull the plug on this war, which they also have the capability to do. So I've said a lot, and I will stop here.